I'd like to introduce Dr. Mika Hackner, Senior Research Associate at the North American Value Institute, and from Allied Voices for Israel, two students from Common Grounds Ambassadors, Einar and Melanie, will be speaking on the panel, and also Heidi Berger, who is the award-winning film producer and professor of communications at Confronting University, based in Montreal, Quebec. She is the creator and president of Foundation for Genocide Foundation, which she started after having numerous conversations with university and high school students, which she found critically lacking in knowledge on Holocaust education. First on the panel, Heidi Berger.
Hi, everybody. Everything that I've heard until now has been super interesting, but and unfortunately, the foundation has proof that everything that has been said up to now is all true. I'm honored to actually be a part of this important and timely conference on confronting anti-Semitism in Canada. Thank you to Matthew and Hadassah and the entire Clarity Coalition team for organizing this event. The work that the Clarity Coalition is doing is vital to fight back against extremism in all forms. The issue of confronting anti-Semitism has become more urgent, obviously, because of the dramatic rise in hateful rhetoric and hate crimes, not just in North America, across the world, and especially after October 7th. This has affected all aspects of our society in North America, fueled in large part through the coordinated campaign aimed at the most vulnerable, our young people. I will be focusing today on solutions. What our foundation believes is the key to standing up to the tide of anti-Semitism sweeping North America since the attacks on October 7th, preventing it and other forms of hate from developing in our youth, which is education. And the challenges we face in educating young people today are greater than ever. The mission of our foundation is to ensure that the history of genocide and the steps leading to genocide are taught to every high school student in Canada and the US. We are accomplishing this goal through presentations by survivors of genocide, not only the Holocaust, survivors of the children and even grandchildren, through educational resources for teachers and through advocacy with governments. What we learned today is shocking. Students were graduating from high school, not even knowing what the word genocide means. And this is in Canada and the US. They have to understand the steps leading to the Holocaust and other genocides, so they will develop critical thinking in this area and can make sense of what's going on in the world today. And they also must develop an awareness of online hate on mainstream social media. Learning how anti-Semitism can be normalized, escalate into violence, and ultimately lead to genocide is more important than ever for students to recognize. They may not even realize they are being manipulated by the disinformation they read and watch online under the guise of important news. The tragic and deliberate shooting of the young couple working in the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, and the firebomb attack on a march for the hostages in Gaza are the direct results of the propaganda campaign waged by extremist groups against all Jews worldwide. This campaign has only ramped up since the attack on innocent Israeli civilians on October 7th. With extremist groups using anti-Israel and anti-Zionist sentiment as a veil for latent anti-Semitism. Now, I have some statistics for you. A panel survey commissioned by the Association of Canadian Studies last spring found 18% of Canadians between 18 and 24 years old agreed with the statement, "I think the Holocaust was exaggerated." And among Canadians between 25 and 34-year-olds, 15% agreed with that statement. This is significant because a clear connection has been made between a lack of knowledge about the Holocaust and negative attitudes towards Jews. And we know that what happens with the Jews rarely stays with the Jews. A lack of knowledge about history inevitably leads to negative views of other communities. But how is this history being taught? And is it enough to prevent anti-Semitic views from taking hold? Almost 30 American states have mandated Holocaust education, and now 5 Canadian provinces, including Ontario, have done the same. As you see, Quebec is conspicuously absent from this list, and we're trying hard. In a survey we conducted last year with social science high school teachers across Canada, we discovered that most teachers introduced Holocaust education through history or literature, and the benefits are clear: combating anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, promoting respect for diversity, encouraging critical thinking, developing more informed and engaged citizens, empowering students to act, and creating empathy and understanding. But despite this formal education, many students' first or sometimes only encounters with the Holocaust come via non-traditional sources, such as comic books, social media influencers, and video games. And the facts that are being presented online either minimize what happened or deny the Holocaust altogether. This past year, we've witnessed an explosion of online posts targeting Jews and Zionists. There's also a multitude of posts openly mocking or denying the Holocaust. This online campaign poses the greatest challenge to the benefits of Holocaust education today. Our survey also asked teachers if they encountered any obstacles in teaching about the Holocaust. In addition to time constraints, lack of training, and limited resources, anti-Semitism has now been cited as the biggest barrier. Anti-Semitism amongst staff, fear of teaching the topic after October 7th, and possible backlash from parents, all of which the foundation has experienced. And now there's another challenge, a threat posed to educators. A very concerning trend to include Palestinian history and issues as part of the school curriculum under the umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as the introduction of anti-Palestinian racism initiative. What is effectively happening is a politicization of our schools to indict Israel of committing genocide. This is a book that it is being circulated in an Ottawa school board in the elementary schools. Disinformation is not only seen online, but even in the books used in some schools across Canada. This disinformation can lead to false assumptions and contribute to anti-Semitic views. The increase in these books and resources is only the tip of the iceberg. We also have had cancellations of our Holocaust presentations by schools who are afraid of triggering emotions of students from Arab or Palestinian backgrounds, as shown in our survey. But we fight back. I don't want anybody to think that we sit still. We had an entire day of presentations from Yom HaShoah in a school in Ottawa suddenly canceled because of their announcement of a new vetting process for all outside organizations. Nothing else was planned for this important day where learning could have taken place. I just want to be clear, though, we fought with emails and a lot of threats of press, and they now have invited us back in November for a Holocaust Education Day. Just a month ago, this happened to us. Angry emails were sent to the principal and board of a school by 2 parents of Palestinian students who attended a Holocaust presentation. These letters accused our presenter, a daughter of survivor, of platforming Zionist views and of weaponizing the Holocaust. Those are the words they used. To be clear, the majority of schools are wonderful, but schools that have experienced these situations with parents are telling us they probably won't have a Holocaust presentation next year. But I don't think we're going to let that go because we're planning a huge campaign. So the question remains, with the influence of social media, online news, and the new challenge of anti-Semitism amongst teaching staff and pro-Palestinian pushback, is Holocaust education alone powerful enough to confront anti-Semitism? If not, what can we do as educators and teachers? Our foundation firmly believes that if young people and even teachers do not learn about the history of anti-Semitism, how it shapeshifts to assume different identities, and if they don't learn about the consequences of this hate, they are easy targets for those who seek to spread conspiracy theories and lies. Learning about the Holocaust alone is not enough anymore. This is why our presentations also talk about the definition of anti-Semitism and the dangers of online anti-Semitism. We also teach students that anti-Semitism did not begin or end with the Holocaust, but has taken on other forms throughout history. We also fight tirelessly against online hate, confronting misinformation on platforms from TikTok to Instagram to YouTube through our social media content. We also promote resources on contemporary anti-Semitism, especially the toolkit called Unlearn Anti-Semitism, developed by CEJA and Facing History in Ourselves, and an online guide for teachers on how to teach about sensitive topics like genocide, co-written by one of the lead authors of the Guide on Genocide. Students, and this is the guide that we collaborated with the Minister of Education. Students and teachers alike must also learn the proper definition of the word genocide, which you have all mentioned, which is a deliberate attempt to destroy an ethnic or religious group. The word genocide, we know, has been used inaccurately to describe conflicts, especially the one between Hamas and Israel. This definition is included in all our presentation and is at the heart of the guide for teachers that we collaborated with the Quebec Education Ministry and professors called Studying Genocide. Most important, the guide focuses on case studies of 9 recognized 20th century genocides, including the Holocaust, video testimonials that we produced, and lesson plans. It's available online and is already being used by over 300,000 students in Quebec alone. I must say as well that in our presentations, teachers usually ask us, what are we going to say about Hamas? And are we going to bring it up? What we do say is we bring it up as Hamas being a terrorist, anti-Semitic organization. The world today is more challenging than ever for our young people. So many voices shouting at them without their taking the time to learn or check facts. It's no wonder that they are so easily swayed to hate the other. We must remember, reflect, and respond. And we must, above all, make sure that the future leaders of our world, today's students graduating from high school, are given the knowledge and the tools to recognize anti-Semitism in all its forms and to fight back against it. In answer again to the question, does Holocaust education prevent anti-Semitism? I say Holocaust education is not the only way to prevent anti-Semitism, but without Holocaust education, anti-Semitism is sure to grow. We need both learning about the Holocaust and learning about anti-Semitism to protect our community and, by extension, our entire society from extremist ideologies. As we say at the end of all our presentations to students, the fight against hate and intolerance has to begin in the classroom. We must continue, despite the challenges we face today, to believe in the power of Holocaust education, a renewed Holocaust education to confront and defeat anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. let's move on to Allied Voices for Israel, and both of you have the floor now.
I'm just wondering if you could both just introduce yourselves quickly and tell us, first of all, we want to thank you for coming and participating. I feel that students have had to bear a huge brunt of this battle. And I cannot imagine having to go through university now. And I think comparatively, when I went through, how much simpler it was. But if you could just introduce us with your names and which school you belong to. I know that Matthew has a series of questions that he wants to ask you.
Sure. I'll go ahead and start. My name is Pe'er. I graduated from Western last year with an honor specialization in international relations, and I'm now at the University of Toronto, where I've just wrapped up my first year of law school.
Pastor.
And
Hi, my name is Melanie Segev. I am a double major at McGill University in International Development and Gender Studies, and I'm going into my third year.
Excellent. Well, my first question, both of you, would be: can you describe for us what has been like being a Jewish student at your university since October 7th, and can you contrast it with experiences pre-October 7th?
I guess I'll go ahead and start with my experience at Western, because I didn't attend U of T pre-October 7th. But I'll say that before October 7th, I felt like a student, and after October 7th, I felt like an activist, and that hasn't changed since. Jewish activism has become like a full-time job, and it's become incredibly difficult to focus on your studies when you feel often the weight of the world on your shoulders every time you come on campus. You're constantly thinking about what anti-Semitic incident is going to be next, what anti-Semitic thing is going to be said in the classroom. And you also feel incredibly isolated by your peers who were once your friends. And I think what was really interesting for me on campus was that the violence started immediately. On October 8th, I was in an international relations classroom, and people felt too comfortable talking about their support for what had happened the day before. And in that moment, I realized that, peers who I thought had nothing to do with this conflict, have no like direct family history or anything, already had preconceived notions of how this conflict started and its justification. And so the rest of the story was already sort of being written. And I think that that's when I realized that we have a lot of work to do as Jewish students, and those of us who feel comfortable speaking especially, to really shift the narrative with the students who don't have that sort of formed opinion yet. And that's really just defined the past almost 2 years, I guess now, of work that we've done on campus.
Yeah, I really second what Pe'er said, of that the experience post October 7th at a university now is not the student life of going to parties and having mentors and like having really great connections with your peers. It's really more about like, I'm here to get an education, to get my diploma, but also to represent Israel, to represent Jewish people. And it's a very isolating experience in the sense that, especially in the arts have been affected very, very hard. I'm in some of the most anti-Semitic programs at McGill University, and I still wear my necklaces. I still have my stickers everywhere. But I do know eyes are on me, and I do see people's reactions when they see what I'm wearing and what my opinions are. And I do have professors who wear keffiyehs and who constantly talk about the genocide in Gaza. Writing exams, all of my friends had invigilators wearing keffiyehs, and it's an experience that I do not wish upon anyone. And I can't really compare it to university life pre-October 7th, because 2023 was my first year in university, but it's definitely an experience that I wish I didn't have to have, because I feel like the college experience has been ripped away from me. I'm not getting the normal one that people should be getting.
My second question would be: do you feel targeted for being Jewish, Zionist, and by students or faculty? And did you feel unsafe on campus? And can you describe those moments?
Do you want to go ahead first, Melanie, then?
Sure. So McGill University has been one of the biggest hubs of anti-Semitism in Canada. We had a 3-month encampment last year. Um, we've also had multiple attacks to a lot of our campus buildings. So a lot of them have been completely destroyed. In Canada, it's cold, so you're basically shivering in class because your classrooms are 10 steps away from broken windows. Um, so it does feel scary to be Jewish, and a lot of people hide their necklaces. They don't wear kippas. They're hiding their identities, which for me feels like we are going back in time because our ancestors fought for us to be able to wear our symbols proudly. But here, a lot of my friends are telling me like they feel like they're closeted Jews on campus because they feel so scared to lose opportunities, to lose mentors, to lose ways of making a living, to lose connections with peers because they know that they are Jewish or Zionist. And that creates a really, really, really scary environment when you're starting out your life as a young 20-year-old.
Um, I'll have to have I have a different perspective when it comes to this, just because I think that the two schools that I've attended, at least in the faculties I've attended, have handled this far better than places like McGill or Concordia. I'll say that at Western, in the classroom at least, the topic was off table after like October 9th. I was in the international relations faculty, and they were instructed to not talk about it in class at all, which, some people have their own opinions about, but I think it's certainly made for a better environment in the classroom at that moment. Outside the classroom, it was, again, like, you walk by, you see the encampment, it's uncomfortable, but I think I'm a person with a nature that doesn't really shy away from those things, but I certainly saw other people, like Melanie mentioned, who felt like they were not able to express themselves as Jews anymore. At U of T Law, on the other hand, I'll say that because we have such a big Jewish population, people are proud, people are open. I've never heard of anyone having to hide their Jewish symbols. And I also feel like the faculty does support Jewish life very actively on campus. So, as a little bit of beacon of hope, I suppose, for you who have been hearing all these awful things from campus, there are faculties within schools who do it right. And I'm lucky enough to have found a faculty that does that now.
I have two more questions for you. One, were you able to find allies, Jewish or non-Jewish, supported you in challenging anti-Semitism on campus?
Um, Yes. I think the majority of people are just regular people who want to live their lives on campus and get their education and are not remotely interested in this conflict whatsoever. But when you, as a friend, engage with them in one-on-one conversations about what this, war means to you and how you've approached it, you end up finding a lot more support than you would have thought. That's not to say that there's people that will completely just stop talking to you, because there will be. But I find that the majority of students who were my friends before were, open to having conversations. And I've been very lucky to have found, friends who want to listen to my opinion. And even though they have nothing to do with this conflict outside of me as a Jewish person, I suppose, being their friend, they want to have these conversations. So I think there's a lot of noise on campuses, and on some more than others. But when Jewish students take it upon themselves to share their experiences with people that they trust, I think you end up finding a lot more support than you would initially think, even though that might not be shared by them publicly all the time. That you're influencing people in the one-on-one personal sense. And that's something that I found very reassuring.
I think for me, yes, I have found allies, but they are, it feels like they are few and far between. Um, it's hard because I feel like I have to search them out. And it's not necessarily that they're coming up to Jewish students and being, how can I help? How can I support? Um, and it is a process to build relationships with them. Um, and also too, I've been really involved in the Jewish student community, and that's how I've found allies and friends and stuff. But um, I think honestly, I would say a lot of the student population at McGill is very, very open about their hate against Israel. Um, and so it's sometimes you're not necessarily sure whether to expose if you're a Zionist or if you're Jewish because it's just that fear. I've gone up to people at activity fair nights where clubs are presenting, and I've spoken as the Hillel representative. And they're like, "What's that?" And then I explain it's the Jewish Life on Campus Club, and then you see immediately the reactions frowning. So the environment is still very hostile, I would say. And there is that fear of being the victim of an anti-Semitic interaction, for sure.
And my final question to you both: what gives you hope, or what keeps you grounded as you continue your studies in this challenging time?
I think the encampment did more harm to their movement than benefit among students on campus. And that really, really reassured me that there are still people in this world who recognize, things for what they are. People would walk by and they would just be like, don't they have jobs? Or like, what are they doing? Like, this is so lame. And I was like, yeah, you're right, it is. And they were being very disruptive to students, and students recognized that disruption, while not immediately, definitely later on. And I think that's really what gives me hope. It's that our approach as Jewish students, one that's personal, calm, educated, well-informed, is really working more often than the other side of things. And that's not to say we're not battling a whole other battle on social media, which I won't even touch on because that's so beyond me. But I'll say that seeing people's responses to their movement versus responses to ours sometimes, especially when we have one-on-one conversations with allies, really does give me hope that we're approaching this right, and that we are approaching it like we're being the better person, the bigger person here. And I want to ensure that we continue to do that, and we don't stoop down to that level of, shouting and screaming and being violent. And I think that's the grace with which we've approached this entire issue, I think, has really given me hope.
For me, I would say what keeps me going is that if not me, who? Um, I strongly believe that is my duty to be an advocate for the Jewish people in the diaspora, in Israel, and for Israel as a nation, as the Jewish homeland. For me, it is not a choice, but it is a duty, and that is what I can do for my people as a diasporic Jew. I see what my counterparts are doing in Israel. I've been in Israel for a month, and the 18, 19, 20-year-olds like, wow. So for me, it feels like the least that I could do for Israel is to be a voice, to humanize us on campus. And the connections that I'm losing out in university because of my Zionism, for me, it's really, it's something that needs to be done. And I'll make new connections that are better. But for me, it's like, it's a duty, and it's a privilege to be defending Israel, and to be defending the Jewish people. I mean, our ancestors worked too hard for us to quit now. So yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Stay till the end of the
Thank
panel.
you.
We'll have questions for you.
Yes, thank you very much, both of you. We'd like to go now to Mika Hackner.
Hi everyone. Thanks for having me here today. It's great to be a part of this incredibly important conference. I'm Dr. Mika Hackner. I'm the Director of Research at the North American Values Institute. And I'll be talking about anti-Palestinian racism, perhaps treading over some ground that's already been tread, but I hope not. And as Mark said, the Canadian community doesn't have a handle on what it actually is. So I'm hoping that this talk helps with that. So I'll be talking about where it comes from, what it means, and what its implications are, particularly for Canada, but also here in the United States. So, as you know, the definition of anti-Palestinian racism, or APR, comes out of Canada. It comes from an organization called the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, ACLA, and they developed the definition in 2020. And they developed the term because of a case involving a University of Toronto faculty of law professor who had a position, a job offer revoked. They claimed that this was because of this professor's Palestinian activism. The university says it was visa issues, and that once those were sorted, they in fact tried to re-offer her the job, but it was too late at that point. And so they wanted to get involved in this court case against the university, and they said this is a clear-cut case of anti-Palestinian racism. And in the research to make this claim, they found that no definition of anti-Palestinian racism existed to prove this very clear-cut case of anti-Palestinian racism. So they had to make it up. And that's what they said. We had to make up claims. We had to make up the definition, we had to create the definition in order to make this claim. And the definition that they made up is the following. Anti-Palestinian racism is a form of anti-Arab racism that silences, excludes, erases, stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives, right? That tag on is very important, or their narratives. Anti-Palestinian racism takes various forms, including denying the Nakba and justifying violence against Palestinians, failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people with a collective identity, belonging and rights in relation to occupied and historic Palestine, erasing human rights and dignity and worth of Palestinians, excluding or pressuring others to exclude Palestinian perspectives, Palestinians and their allies, okay, and their allies, again, a very important tag on here, defaming Palestinians and their allies with slander such as being inherently anti-Semitic, a terror threat, sympathizer, or opposed to democratic values. And then Akla goes into what each of these conditions contain. So for example, Nakba denial, right? The Nakba, the catastrophe of Israel's founding. Nakba denial constitutes claims there are no such people called Palestinians or no state of Palestine exists, right? That's written in the present tense. That Palestinians do not originate from a land called Palestine, rejecting the inalienable right of Palestinian refugees to return to Israel is anti-Palestinian racism, and denying that Palestinians were ethnically cleansed to create Israel is anti-Palestinian racism. Justification of violence includes equating the oppressed with the oppressors, or blaming the oppressed for the actions of the oppressor, or rationalizing the use of violence against Palestinians. And then failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people includes denying the existence of Palestine and denying the settler colonialization of Palestine, right? So if you deny that Israel is a settler colonial state, you're racist. And so what this means, and I'm going to talk about particularly for education, for the classroom setting here, is that in a classroom, if a student wants to challenge the narrative of the Nakba, challenge the idea that Palestinians were ethnically cleansed, talk about the various historical complicating factors that we know of, land sales, Arab leaders encouraging Arab communities to leave the land that would later become Israel, that student can credibly be accused of anti-Palestinian racism. If a student wants to discuss the decades of Palestinian terrorism and Israel's response to that terrorism, including the response to October 7th, including perhaps the IDF's operation to rescue hostages, that would be anti-Palestinian racism because now perhaps you're justifying violence against Palestinians. If a student takes issue with the characterization of Israel as a settler colonial state, that's anti-Palestinian racism, right? So any kind of discussion about the founding of Israel that deviates from this narrative is going to be severely hampered in our K through 12 classrooms, in our university seminars, for fear of being called racist, right? And what this means is that any deviation from the particular Palestinian narrative is racism. The inclusion or consideration of Israel's history is racism. History, facts, political disagreement can be recast as racism. And the other thing that I want you to note here is that they are very careful to say that anti-Palestinian racism affects Palestinians and their allies. I've sat in on a number of webinars where they talk about this, where they hammer home the fact that people don't need to be Palestinian to be impacted by anti-Palestinian racism, right? They're very clear on saying this. And so what that means in practice is that non-Palestinians can claim to be victims of anti-Palestinian racism and therefore can make claims against someone of anti-Palestinian racism, and those claims can be credible, right? So, as I said, the definition of APR did not exist prior to 2020. Dania Majid, the president of ACLA, set out to create one. And using the term racism was a conscious choice, a strategic choice. And I'll provide several direct quotes from Majid here as an illustration of this fact. So in an August 2022 webinar, she explains that ACLA decided to use the term anti-Palestinian racism for a number of reasons, including, and here's the quote, "The oppression of Palestinians is one of settler colonialism and manifests itself in the crimes of apartheid, which are both racist systems that privileges one group over another. The attacks on Palestinians and our allies is used to uphold these racist systems. It is necessarily or exclusively about the hatred of the individual, it isn't necessarily or exclusively about the hatred of the individual, but more about targeting those who dare to speak up for Palestinians and against these systems, right, these racist systems. And importantly, there is also much work, learning, and solidarity happening with our allies resisting anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, as well as other forms of discrimination, and we need to be working together. The expression of anti-Palestinian racism may be intersectional. Anti-Palestinian racism may be amplified for those who are members of historically marginalized groups." And then she goes on to say that there is so much mobilization around settler colonialism for Indigenous communities in Canada, with Black Lives Matter and anti-Black racism in Canada, and also around homophobia. And so working with these movements, she says, can help further the Palestinian cause. And again, I'm going to quote directly here. "People may not understand the history or politics of Palestine, but they understand racism, and they're able to call it out and identify it without being versed in all things Palestine. We decided to use anti-Palestinian racism as a term because we knew, because of the path that's already been created, that people would understand what racism meant. And when you put a charge of racism to an institution, in many instances, those institutions already have policies in place or have some sort of mechanism where they have to respond and engage with an affected party who is claiming to have experienced racism in their institutions." Okay, so the definition of and the naming of anti-Palestinian racism was created with these two things in mind. One, putting it into the language of social justice, because no one wants to be a racist. No one, as Mark and David were saying earlier, no one wants to be accused of being a racist. No one wants to say or do something racist. And so it makes them sort of pay attention to that and want to be careful about that. But secondly, it's to get within the lexicon and the activities of the social justice activism that we're seeing, that built from 2020 and even to today, right? To put the Palestinian cause within this intersectional activist group for cross-solidarity mobilization. And that's why something like a school trip in the Toronto District School Board to see what's happening in Indigenous communities can then have a cross-current with a Palestinian protest or Palestinian activists. That's why that occurs, right? And then the second thing, and this is the important sort of strategic piece here, if you claim racism, institutions, educational institutions will have mechanisms that they will have to, by which they will have to respond. Right? If you put in a claim of racism, it's very hard for a school to then sweep that claim under the rug. They have to respond to it. And once they respond to that, you can then institutionalize anti-Palestinian racism through things like having it adopted in your school district, through professional development training, through different curricula design, through school outings and activities for students. And this is what we're seeing in Canada, right? I don't have to tell you, in June of last year, the Toronto District School Board became the first to formally adopt APR as a recognized form of racism. And they adopted it without queuing to a definition, but the only definition that's really out there is the ACLA definition, this incredibly broad and politicized definition, right? And then just last month, they decided that they were going to fast track the implementation of anti-Palestinian racism into their anti-hate strategies so that it will become active in October this year. And what that means is that there are going to be mandatory professional development training sessions for trustees and board members in the Toronto District School, in the Toronto School District on anti-Palestinian racism. And that is going to trickle down into teacher training. It's going to trickle down into the resources that are going to be into classes. And the US is trying to learn from Canada's example. So there are a number of school districts that have already filed Title VI claims of discrimination on the basis of anti-Palestinian racism. The Berkeley Unified School District has done this. The Santa Clara Unified School District has done this. Many college campuses have done this already, but I'm really focused on K through 12. So those are the examples that come to mind. And the goal of these complaints is to mirror what's happening in Toronto. We're going to claim racism so that we can get professional development training and bring APR into the classroom. So that's one way that they're doing it. The other way that they're doing it is by saying, hey, if you're going to have anti-Semitism training, then it's really only right and fair that you balance it with APR training. And we've seen this in some school districts in California where they firstly don't like the fact that legacy Jewish organizations are hosting anti-Semitism training. So they'll walk out of those trainings, or they'll have alternative ones with anti-Zionist organizations. And then they'll also say, we need to have anti-Palestinian racism training. And so there have been a number of documented cases where teachers have had to attend anti-Palestinian racism training. So it's happening, and it's going to enter our schools, I think, more and more as a balancing narrative. And these are really the two things that I want to leave you with. It's really important, and I think, Mark made this point, this is not about racism, this is a political tool and a political strategy. And when you break down that definition, it's very clear that this is what's going on. And when you listen to their own words, it's very clear that this is what is going on, right? And I think it's incredibly important that the Jewish community understands this, and that they really study that definition so that they can fight against it. Thank you.
Yeah. Heidi, yes, do you have a question?
This was most interesting. I learned so much. But I just want to ask you from a practical point of view. So what do? We had a Holocaust presenter. We get 2 emails from 2 Muslim parents saying they do not want Holocaust presentations in the school anymore because we're weaponizing the word Holocaust, and if we have a Holocaust presentation, there should be a presentation on the genocide in Israel. From a practical point of view, we fought others well. This particular school, which is a huge school board in Montreal, how do we fight it? What do we do? It's not, it's become, so I did ask the principal, I said, so does this mean that you're going to have a problem inviting us back next year? And she said, we've had you many, many years in a row. They've had us maybe for 8 years in a row with Holocaust president. And she said, yes, it could be a problem. What do we do?
I think, and this might not be something that you in particular would want to hear, but I think this is the problem with sort of allowing the door for identity politics or for politics at all into the schools. This is why I have sympathy with the IRA definition, but it has also opened the door to APR, right? The way that they designed APR, now again, there are substantive differences with the IRA definition. It's not at all the same thing as APR, but they designed APR to mirror it. If you read them side by side, it's like copy my homework, but don't make it obvious, right? But they can say, well, if you're going to have this definition, well, then you also need to have our definition, right? And I think that the way that we have, it's an argument that sort of sympathetic or well-meaning people would want to listen to, So I think one thing that you can do is sort of go down to Tachlis and say, well, here's the definition of genocide. What's happening now is a current war, a current political conflict. And, it's a different kettle of fish. What I'm talking about is something that was historical. It's something that's important to understand for the context of the Jewish community in Canada for X, Y, and Z. But it's not about a current political happening. But I do think it's going to require us to really, and this is not my area, but really rethink how we approach Holocaust education on a global scale, because I don't know if it's worked to, I think I don't know if it's working to counter the pushback that we're seeing and to counter the increase in anti-Semitism.
Students still there?
Yes.
Ask the question of students.
Yes.
So I have a question for the students and then a question for Heidi. I'm wondering, you spoke about how your colleagues treated you after October 7th. I would like to know whether any faculty stood up for you in any, or for other students you're aware of, or whether in fact you're experiencing some of the same anti-Semitic behavior from faculty. Because what I've understood is that many Jewish faculty themselves are feeling stressed and put upon, but they're also saying that a lot of the leadership in the anti-Semitic activities on campus are coming faculty.
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, Melanie had to drop off, and I think she would have probably been better suited to answer your question, just because it seems as though she's had a bit more of a difficult experience when it comes to faculty at her school. And I think that's true across the board from the people I speak to, that it's a whole different ballgame in places like Quebec. I will say that at Western, faculty listened to the higher ups' instructions to completely steer away from the topic in classrooms, and that's exactly what they did. They shut down discussion when it came up. And I was in a class that was all about Arab women, and I knew the political leanings of my professor, yet she did not choose to express that in the classroom and really did steer away from the topic. So I'm very appreciative that that happened, because while we didn't get to have good engagement, that rarely actually happens in the classroom when the topic is brought up. So I think that that was likely the best path forward. And then I will say that at U of T Law, we've had several anti-Semitic incidents over the past year. And faculty has been incredibly responsive. Every time we come into their office, they're there to welcome us with open arms, and they really do listen to our concerns. And I've seen actionable steps taken from their side to minimize such things from happening again. So.
Thank you. And Heidi, I wanted to ask you, yeah, I can see you on. I'm familiar with the writings of Ruth Wist, and you probably are, and she indicates that in her view, teaching or education about the Holocaust has been pretty ineffective over time. She argues that it's really just focused too much on 4 years and not the whole history of the Jewish people nor current anti-Semitism. And it's true, if you talk about what caused the Holocaust, you're into talking about, Nazi racist laws. So how do you go from there to introducing the sources of it today, which are from the left and from Islamism?
There's a two-part answer. The first answer is we've changed our presentations, first of all, to include anti-Semitism, the history of we're limited during a presentation to 50 minutes, 45 minutes, because you have to give time for questions, right? So we've changed our presentations to include a little bit about the history of anti-Semitism, giving them examples and explaining what anti-Semitism is. But then, of course, most of the topic is about this survivor story, or our parents' survival, etc. So it's limited, but I can guarantee you that do we bring in present anti-Semitism? We bring it into, unfortunately, because of time constraints, we maybe have a paragraph and a half on what's going on today. We use present day images, etc. We just don't have the time. If this is a Holocaust presentation, and we are so grateful now to teachers that are asking us to come to their school still to give a presentation on Holocaust, we don't have the time. If they want a Holocaust presentation, we don't have the time to really go into anti-Semitism, present day anti-Semitism, etc. There's
Do you
just
have
no time.
any, do you have then any thought or practice in developing metrics to see if it actually has anything to do with decreasing anti-Semitism today?
We haven't done that yet. That's our next project. We're going to do a Canadian survey with teachers, asking them if we're going to do a survey asking them if having their Holocaust presentation, was there talk afterwards? Did teachers follow up with talking about present day anti-Semitism? And we're looking for those statistics in the near future, because otherwise, but you know what? We're not going to stop going into high schools to talk about the Holocaust.
No, I understand. What I
we can't.
Now, what I actually was wondering, if you go beyond the Holocaust, because as I said, those 4 years in history don't tell the story of the Jewish people. They tell you about dead Jews, and everybody feels badly, but it doesn't fix today's problem. But I had an interesting conversation with a teacher here in Niagara at a conference that happened a couple of weeks, months ago. And he talked about taking his class, the school board he's working with has developed a program where they take the kids into some Jewish institutions in the community to meet living Jews, to hear what their experience today is in terms of how they're treated and what they're experiencing. And I thought that was interesting because it takes it to now, right? So kids can see that what we're experiencing now is harmful.
Right. So as I said, I think that's a great idea. Time is always of the essence with these teachers. They have limited time. The students have limited time. And right now, I mean, we do mention it in 2 sentences about what's going on now. I always say I'm happy my mother, in a way, I miss my mother terribly, but in a way I'm happy that she's not here to see what's going on. And we talk a bit about that, but it's a great idea. But right now you realize we're fighting desperately to have the study of genocide being made mandatory in schools. I mean, I just feel there's this huge battle, and there's only so much we could do. I wish there were 10 other foundations like us that could carry this battle with us. I think we're up against such a huge battle here in education.
Just following up on, did you want to? Mark has been waiting to ask. Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. Mark, your hand's up. You have a question? Mark?
That might have been.
Oh.
It's actually a question, Heidi, following up on some of the comments. And the danger is the more you push for genocide studies, the more likely you're going to have to include Palestinian genocide. That's where we're going. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but we see it every time we push for something. We're opening the door for something else. My question is really around the IHRA definition, and what's the strategy now, given that we've got APR on the, being pushed forward. Earlier, one of the speakers said we've got to operationalize the definition. And I'm wondering, in the context of the presentations we heard here now, what does that mean? Should we stop pushing the IHRA definition because the anti-Palestinian racism is copying our homework? U of T has refused to implement the IHRA definition in its fight against Jew hatred, saying they don't need it. It's just sort of your reflection on how it's impacting on the work that you're doing. What does it mean operationalizing the definition, given your experience in the work you're doing?
you'd like me to answer that one?
All the
Pardon?
speakers. I thought that might be a relevant question to each of. So in whichever order you.
Uh, okay, so I'll just quickly say, right now, again, we're giving these presentations to grades 9, 10, 11, okay, and grade 12. So we clearly talk about the intent, but teachers have asked us not to delve into politics, not to delve into what's happening with Israel and Hamas. They don't want to go there. So we don't, because we want to get invited back, to be honest. There's a question period, and usually what's been happening is these kids don't know anything about the Holocaust. After the Holocaust presentation, you can hear a pin drop. Very rarely do we get a question about what's going on presently. But to warn the teachers, we do send them questions and answers on sensitive topics so that they do have the answers to some of the questions they're going to get about genocide, the meaning of genocide, etc. Don't forget, it's grades 9, 10, 11, and 12. So there's very little wiggle room right now to explore any other definitions. We're constrained in a way. Are we going to change the definition to genocide? I imagine we have to. We definitely have to.
So if I can respond to a couple of the points that have been made. Heidi asked the question, and it's a good one, about how you advocate for Holocaust education at the same time resist the advocacy for education on what's alleged to be a genocide in Gaza. I think it's an important point to make that the Holocaust in legislative and statutory provisions in Canada is now adopted as an accepted event. So we have an offense of willful promotion of anti-Semitism that means the denial or the minimization of the Holocaust, and there's a definition in the criminal code as to what the Holocaust actually means. So first of all, it can't be argued by anyone reasonably that students should be immunized from being taught about something that is now so beyond reasonable dispute that it is contained in our criminal code and recognized as something that occurred. And moreover, there's now jurisprudence that says that it is so beyond dispute that the courts take judicial notice of its existence, which means that you needn't even prove it in a dispute that involves the Holocaust because it is incapable of being disputed. And that distinguishes it from contemporary events where the verdict is not in yet in any way as to whether or not the conduct that is being dealt with in Gaza rises to the level or does not rise to the level of genocide. And contrary to what some of our adversaries have said, there has been no finding in any judicial forum whatsoever that Israel has committed a genocide. Now, this argument may become more difficult depending upon what the International Court of Justice ultimately does, even though it's only issuing an advisory opinion ultimately on it. But the bottom line is that's the distinction. The distinction is that people reasonably debate contemporaneous events. Contemporary events, time tells what are accepted wisdoms coming out of our history. but the Holocaust is beyond dispute, and for that reason is an appropriate topic for education. In terms of the APR and how it impacts upon the IRA definition, I feel very strongly, and I take the point that's been made that the existence of the IRA definition alongside APR makes it more difficult in some respects to resist the APR argument. But in my view, we cannot give up a very big strategic advantage that we currently have, and that is that 43 countries, including Canada, has adopted the IRA definition. Ontario has adopted the IRA definition. The challenge has been in operationalizing it. Part of it has been our own undoing because some of us in the community have been misusing the definition to say the only answer is to create it as a statutory obligation, and that's not the way it's designed. And it does undermine some of our arguments to say that it should be a statutory provision. It's a tool to be used in evaluating whether something rises to the level of anti-Semitism, but it is also fundamentally different from APR, not only because it has been adopted, and the federal government has not adopted APR, it's referred to it in a policy, but it has not created a definition for it, and it is not an integral part yet of the federal anti-racism strategy. But more importantly, the IRA definition, as most of you know, unlike APR, builds in an exemption that says criticism of Israel at the same standards that any country can be criticized is not anti-Semitic. There is no such exemption that exists if you dispute or fail to acknowledge the Palestinian narrative. And moreover, in the illustrations that are contained to the IRA definition, it says that these could amount to anti-Semitic illustrations depending upon the context. So it is fundamentally different in those ways from the APR definition that basically violates constitutional rights, not only because it brands those of us who hold appropriate views, legal views, as racist, but also because in some of its language, it compels us to take the position that the Palestinian narrative, in other words, a failure to acknowledge. So this is forced speech that is imposed on you by the APR definition, which is also unconstitutional and fundamentally different than the IRA definition. So if people understand what the IRA definition is and is not, I think we can draw those kinds of distinctions. But I also take the position in education, universities, K to 12 and the like, is that, for example, in New York University adopted a definition that did not use IRA, but it made the same point in an important way. It said that there can be a connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and provided illustrations of it. And I'm quite content with that. So sometimes IRA attracts all of this heat, and sometimes our strategy can be to ensure that substantively what we're interested in makes its way into a policy without having to force this pitched battle about whether the entire IRA definition is incorporated, right?
I agree with what you're saying in terms of that it is substantially completely different from APR, and one of the problems with APR is its complete breadth and the compelling of speech. I'm just a sort of free speech absolutist, and I think sort of telling people what can and cannot be said in any way is dangerous. So any kind of limiting action has an opposite opposite and equal reaction, which can be dangerous. Heidi, I've got a question for you. Do you talk about sort of the importance of ideology in leading up to the Holocaust? Or how much time do you give to sort of fascism and Nazi ideology?
Again, we have 50 minutes, 45 minutes, and most of that is an interactive video, and the survivor or child of a survivor, grandchild of a survivor speaking, telling the story. They have to hear a survivor's testimonial. We go pre-Nazi. We go definitely into a bit of history pre-Nazi and the ideology. We show examples. We show posters. We show images. We get into it. And I can tell you at grade 9, 10, 11, 12, they understand it by the end. Do they have a huge knowledge of it? But I still say it gets them thinking, and it gets them to understand what's going on.
And I think that, I'm sorry to interrupt you, so keep going. I just think that that's the most powerful thing that you can bring to what's happening in the contemporary context, right? That you show how ideology can grow, how it can take hold in the youth, and what the outcomes can be. And I think that's an incredibly important story to bring to kids in school. So thank you for doing that.
Also, I just want to say one other thing. When we first went to the Quebec government in 2014 and asked them 2012 to have Holocaust education in their schools, we were refused. But they did agree to do 9 recognized UN genocides, including the First Nations. And of course, the Holocaust was part of that. So I think when this is a side, this has nothing to do with, just as an aside, when we have this guide and there's 9 recognized genocides in there, including First Nations, teachers are become more open. So it's not, and we were warned by that by the Education Ministry, it's not just the Holocaust. So if they want a First Nations presentation the year after, we say, sure, we've trained a First Nations great-grandchild of a residential survivor to go into schools as well. So that's aside from everything we've been really talking about. But I have to tell you, this is our way of getting Holocaust education into schools by talking about other genocides as well.
I have a question for us. It's mostly geared towards Heidi. So have you ever considered, with the whole introduction of the APR definition and bringing so-called Palestinian genocide and such history into the school system, have you considered introducing more Sephardic and Mizrahi Holocaust experiences in history, and maybe working with organizations such as Jimena or even former professors that were part of the Jewish studies at York University who did extensive research into this, and maybe even focusing a little bit more on what the Sephardic and Mizrahi community went through during the same time, and also how they were always established in Israel and that they did never leave, because this is a point that the Palestinians, and through much brainwashing and talk to other people, use against the Jewish people. So why not take what they use against us and put it against them? Why not focus just not completely, but a little more on the Sephardic experience?
The idea is great, but unfortunately, we don't have actually the time and the means to do that. We've approached. You don't understand how difficult it is, even to get children of survivors to take the time off to want to go into schools. It takes months and months of going through their parents' or grandparents' survivor testimonials. We have writers that we hire to write the presentations for the survivors, etc. It's very hard to even get children of survivors to be able to commit their time, etc. Your idea is excellent. We've approached a few people, and we haven't been successful. I'm being very honest with you.
Have you worked with organizations such as Jimena who do specialize on this and who bring a lot of speakers?
No, we have not. No. don't forget as well, we also have to have presentations of the other genocides as well. And we need still a Rwandan, just to let everybody know, we had a Rwandan survivor who was a rock star. A lot of schools asked for him and he quit. He's a 35-year-old Rwandan survivor who quit giving presentations because we did not want to say on our website that Israel's committing a genocide. So, and we had an Armenian great-grandchild of a survivor quit on us. So it's not like just work with an organization, get people, whatever. It's not easy for us. It's like we've had to become, it's almost like the suggestion is great, but right now we're struggling to still get schools interested enough to send our children of survivors and grandchildren of survivors into schools. We're limited. I'm being honest, we're limited.
Thank you.
My question is for Heidi. When I first read the ALCA definition of anti-Palestinian racism, I got a little bit cheeky and I wrote another definition that said anti-Israeli racism is a form of anti-Semitism, silences, excludes, or racist stereotypes, defames or dehumanizes Israelis or their narratives. Anti-Israeli racism takes various forms, denying the 1984 mass expulsion of Jews from Arab countries and justifying violence against Israelis, failing to acknowledge Israeli Jews and Israeli Jews as indigenous peoples with collective identities, belonging rights to Israel, etc. And I was just copying Mr. Bean's style, the other guy's homework. But the longer I looked at this definition, I started to think maybe I'm not. It was written kind of tongue in cheek, trying to be cheeky, but maybe there's some reality here, because if this is the definition that our adversaries are trying to push, then why can't we just counter it with direct fire logic and say, if you're going to do that, then we want to have the same thing, sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander. We will concede nothing less. And maybe that's the argument that our major organizations need to apply full force. There's a definition of anti-Semitism in the IRA. That's great, but it stands on its own as a definition of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli racism is not the same thing, because anti-Semitism covers a whole gamut of fields that have nothing to do with Zionism. The idea that Jews are money grubbers trying to take over the world, or they're cheap, or they have big noses, nothing to do with Zionism. So then why don't we have a separate definition that directly bookends anti-Palestinian racism that applies to anti-Israeli racism, which is a real thing, because those protesters out there on the streets and the activists in our classrooms, they're not generally anti-Semitic in the broader sense. They are anti-Israeli. So why don't we call it like it is in exactly so many words?
I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. Absolutely. If I could tell you, we have an intern who's working on his PhD, working for the foundation. He's from originally born in France, and he's South African. And he works for us, and he said and his girlfriend is a pro-Palestinian who's been in groups in protests, and he's extremely smart. But he developed a relationship with one of our writers, and they have extremely, extremely good, peaceful dialogue. And what he says is, why don't Jewish people understand? I am not anti-Semitic, but I am anti-Israel. Why can't people understand that? I have nothing against Jewish people. I just am against Israel.
Okay.
It's
I'd say, okay, fair enough. Then that is a kind of racism on its own. That's anti-Israeli racism. Because if there's going to be an anti-Palestinian racism, then there has to be an anti-Austrian racism and an anti-Polish racism and an anti-Israel racism, because Israel has no less and no more right to exist than any other country.
Correct. But try and explain it to these people. How do we get through to them? How do we get through to them?
I'm sorry, if you're advocating for a definition of anti-Israel racism in the same way that there's an anti-Palestinian racism, I'm vocally opposed to that. I think because the definition of
I'm
anti-Palestinian
actually
racism,
opposed to anti-Palestinian racism too. But if I have to lose that battle, I'd rather have the anti-Israel racism definition than just their own.
I think that we don't want to, firstly, we don't want to go low. And secondly, we need to maintain our liberal values, and trying to curtail speech in that way, or to thought police in the way that APR does, is a dangerous road to go down. And again, you know, when you open the door to this kind of thing, it's going to have impacts down the line that you might not like, that you can't see right now. So it just, yeah, that kind of thought worries me.
Michael, if it's of any comfort, the organizations that have argued against APR, and an article that's soon to be published that a number of us did on the legal and strategic perils of adopting anti-Palestinian and societal perils of adopting anti-Palestinian racism, make the argument that you've just made, but in a different way. And that is that the logical implication of adopting APR would be that there would have to be all these other kinds of racism that really have nothing to do with racism, and are no less invalid than those. So the argument's been made, and is being made, that the logical implications of APR are to start introducing all these other notions. And we don't want them introduced, but we make it as an argument as to why it doesn't make sense. I think that's the better argument in my view.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I'm looking forward to reading that. Yeah.
I agree.
Are there other jurisdictions that are adopting APR in Canada? We know about the TDSB. Are there other boards, other provinces, boards?
Mark, maybe you know better than I.
It's still quite embryonic. Thames Valley, I think, and Toronto District School Board are the two prime. You saw TMU, the faculty union, urged the university to adopt it. So some faculty unions and student organizations have urged its adoption. The federal government has not adopted it. As of yet. The guide, the handbook on Islamophobia, tried to sneakily introduce it because it made reference to APR as a real thing, and then the footnotes included footnotes that referenced the Canadian Arab Lawyers Association definition, and so that's been the subject of quite a bit of lobbying inside the federal government to see if one can reverse that or not allow it to go further. But in some senses, this originated in Canada, but it's been adopted more broadly, or at least introduced more broadly through Title VI claims and so on in the US. So in some respects, the US has a more problematic situation. In some respects, we have a more problematic situation. So.
I would also add to that, and I don't know what it's like in the Canadian context, but watch what happens on the college campus level in the US, because it then trickles down to K through 12. So the fact that a lot of campus organizations, a lot of campus senates are pushing for APR, I think means we're going to see it more and more in school districts. And yeah.
I'm so sorry I have to leave now, but I'd like to thank everybody. This has been super interesting, and I've learned quite a bit. And I just feel the more united we are, the faster we're going to get ahead. The more organizations you know, and really my thanks to Clarity. You're an amazing group, and I'm proud to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.